I am your co-host, John DeLynn, and I'm joined by my brilliant partner.
Oh, so generous. Margi DeLynn.
It's great to have you guys with us again, guys and girls. It is May 9th, 2017. Today, we are covering part 2 of a little 2-part interview with the wonderful Natasha Helfer Parker.
Yes.
She is a licensed marriage and family therapist. She is a licensed sex therapist, one of the few licensed sex therapists in all of Mormonism. And she has been a partner in the Open Stories Foundation since very early on. She runs a Mormon mental health podcast. She's the founder of the Mormon Mental Health Association, along with others. She is amazing.
And a friend.
And a dear friend. And our family may or may not have consulted her in the past when there have been things to consult.
Oh, my Lanta.
So broadcasting to you live today from Wichita, Kansas, the one, the only Natasha Helfer Parker. Welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Well, thank you. That was quite the introduction. Thank you. And you are dear friends. I love you both.
I feel like I should say, let's get ready to rumble. Oh, wait, that's a different context. Okay, so.
That's for our next sex podcast, John.
Yes, that's for the. Yes, as if we haven't done enough. So, Natasha, tell us just really briefly, what did I leave out of the introduction that you would want to share with our audience?
Just to add to the announcement, so Dan Witherspoon and I will be doing a retreat in Salt Lake City area for those who are trying to navigate church life in some kind of nuanced way, whether you're a traditional believer or more of a nuanced, or like I like to call myself, an abstract believer. So that will be July 14th through 16th. And then I would just always plug my Mormon Sex Info podcast and also my online practice, Symmetry Solutions. So that's all.
Beautiful. We'll make sure and add that to our list of announcements. I just added it here to the show notes for this episode, but we will make sure and add that to our ongoing episode list. So that's exciting. That's the second time you guys have done a retreat for people staying in the church and trying to make it work. And I think that's an important audience. So we're really glad you and Dan are doing that. And we'll do our best to get registration info up. Is registration info up on that yet, Natasha?
I believe it's going up on Wednesday, tomorrow.
Okay,
so
great.
We'll be starting to advertise that more directly.
Excellent. All right. Well, last week we covered a lot of topics around healthy relationships. I'm not going to recap them now. If you want to hear some awesome thoughts and discussions about healthy marriage, tune into episode 1, which should be immediately preceding this episode. And now we're going to move on to a whole nother set of topics. And I just want to say that we want to invite, one of the reasons we do live podcast interviews is so that people will share their questions and comments, and then we can incorporate them. So it's a bit more dynamic, a little bit more real time, a little bit more interactive. So those of you listening, we know who you are. Actually, we don't, but there's 56 of you right now that Facebook tells me are tuned in. Unless you have perfect marriages, please post comments or questions or scenarios and give us a chance to jump in and to sort of prime the pump, so to speak. I'm going to go ahead and read one that has been sent in. And before we jump into our topics, we're just gonna dive in. So Natasha, here's one for you. You ready?
I'm ready.
All right. Maintaining a healthy marriage. This is from Julie. Maintaining a healthy marriage is the most important thing for my husband and I. But I feel like my parents blame my husband for us leaving. I feel like they would rather I leave him than leave the church, which is awful. How do you create positive communication and protect your marriage when parents, siblings, and extended family are trying to place blame? Natasha, help Julie. Julie needs your help.
Wow, yeah. So this is not so much necessarily marital relationships as extended family relationships, which are very much a part of every marriage. And interesting how I oftentimes go back to the very biblical advice around this, right? Which is kind of like parents butt out. And
Wait, what's the chapter? What's the chapter and verse on that?
You're expecting me to know that?
I'm kidding.
I
just like
I
that.
did not
Parents
serve
butt out. I like
butt
that.
out. It's the butt out scripture.
You know that one.
But there's something very poetic and beautiful about, I think it's in Exodus or something, but about this cleaving unto one another as a spousal unit, which implies this idea that we are now our own unit, and extended family is supposed to honor that. Now, obviously, extended family can be a great support system. It can be a great resource. At times, it can be an entity that steps in and offers maybe some opinions, for example, domestic violence cases, or where there's really some unhealthy patterns going in. I think it's always important for extended family to be willing to at least speak up and share concerns, and obviously offer support in whatever way they can. But this idea that they are somehow going to tell you whether or not you should stay married, tell you this is what I would do if I was in your position. It's oftentimes what family and friends most often do when you go to them with marital problems or when they perceive marital problems. And this is very typical. It's very well intentioned. They usually really do believe they're right and believe that their thoughts are best for your positions. But it's an overstep. And unfortunately, most family members and friends haven't necessarily gone to what I would call validation school, which is mostly what you're supposed to be doing if somebody's coming to you with marriage issues. You're not necessarily supposed to just fix it and provide a solution. And now people will make decisions based on solutions you've provided that can really be lifelong lasting. I think the most tragic thing, and I'm sure you and Julie will talk a lot about this as you do your mixed faith marriage retreat, is there's nothing doctrinal about this. This is what just blows my mind. There's nothing doctrinal about the idea that if you have a spouse who loses their faith or goes on a different journey spiritually than you, that's somehow justification or a reason to leave your marriage. In fact, I'm 99% sure, and I don't know, again, which scripture it is, but there is a scripture somewhere that says you're actually not supposed to leave a spouse for those reasons. So it's really sad to me when the family values that we espouse so much within Mormonism kind of go under the radar when it comes to this particular issue, which I think is very culturally interesting, I guess is how I would call that. As far as how to go from here, some things that I may recommend is really find your common language with your extended family, really find your common values. And so it can be this combination of a validation approach and also a setting boundaries approach. So I'm going to role model a little bit of this right now. So in other words, Mom, Dad, I hear your pain. Validation, right? It seems to me like it's really hard for the two of you to see us struggling with this spiritual change in our lives, especially since you perceive that it's more from my spouse and that maybe he's influencing me. And everything that you've taught me, right, and everything that you believe, we're questioning, and that must be really painful. And at some level, even though I'm not in your shoes, I can really kind of get that. And I'm so sorry that our situation is causing you this pain. That is all validation. You don't have to agree with anything that they're doing to be able to offer something along those lines. Mm-hmm. Now it's boundary setting time, right? And even though I appreciate your advice, and even though I appreciate your love and concern for us, some of the things that you're saying to us is causing us a problem. And I'm going to need for that to stop. I'm going to need for you to not tell me that I should be leaving my husband. If that can't stop, if you can't stop doing that, then I'm going to have to figure out different ways to communicate with you, because at this particular time, that's just not going to be what I need to help me at a very difficult time to figure out what I'm going to negotiate with my marriage. So I'm hoping that you can honor that boundary. Now I'm going to shared values talk. So you taught me the importance of marriage. You taught me, Mormonism taught me, speak your common language. Mormonism, like one of the things I love about my Mormon journey was how much it talked about families and the family structure and how vows that we took are really important, and promises and covenants. And even if these words trigger you and you don't normally use them anymore, you can use them with your family. They mean things to them, right? And so these are promises that I made. And I knew you taught me that part of the deal when I got married was going to be negotiation and compromise, and that it was going to be hard work, and that we wouldn't know all the things that would come our way and the problems that we would face. So this is one of our challenges, and I plan to stick to my Mormon values, or the values that you taught me, in trying to work this, this thing out with my husband. And I hope that you honor that. So that was a nice kind of sandwich approach, right? Because you start with validation, the nice, soft, fluffy bread. You put the meat in the middle, which is the boundaries and kind of your firmness and what you're wanting and asking for in return. And then you finish with the warm, fuzzy bread of shared language. And thank you for teaching me these values. And you really played a significant role in my life and why I'm choosing some of this path that you may not totally understand or agree with. And whether that value is honesty or authenticity or family, or again, we have many shared values still with our extended family.
Love it.
Love that.
Love the role playing. And actually, Holly writes in, I love this role playing, Natasha. This really helps a lot.
Yeah.
So we love it. Holly loves it. I think other listeners are loving it too. Lots of people have joined us. It's fun to see, Steve and Kimberly and Mark and Julie and all sorts of people joining us live. So please keep these questions and comments coming. It's really good. Paulette actually tried to give us a little bit of scriptural support. She kind of supported scripture. Paulette wrote, when you get married, you leave behind the things of childhood. You leave your parents' home and authority over you and, quote, cleave only unto, quote, and go whither he goest. I think she's quoting Ruth there. I think she's also quoting some Doctrine and Covenants. So, Paulette, thank you for the scriptural support. And that was good, Natasha. So thank you for helping out with that question. All right. So we have several fun things we're going to cover today. And again, we'll stop and pause and interject listener questions or comments as soon as they come in. But Natasha, one of the presentations you like to do is around the common myths of marriage. And I think you referred to these last episode a little bit, but why don't you just refresh us really quick on the common myths, just so that, and we won't go into them in any depth, but remind us what the common myths are that you like to talk about.
Yeah, and this is by no means all inclusive even of what I talk about, but just some of the common ones are, you belong to me, I belong to you. In other words, this ownership that we sometimes fall into in marital relationships, which I think is confused with the idea of compromise. So I think we sometimes confuse the idea of compromise with this idea that you should never do anything that I would be uncomfortable with. And therefore, it's a permission type of relationship, and it also can play into a lot of authority, power struggles within a couple. And so I think that that's an important myth to challenge. And it's one that's been kind of in our westernized culture. It's not just a Mormon myth.
Yeah.
I think that another myth is this idea that I should be the object of your full affection, and that mainly what that means is that I get like 100% of my needs met through you. And so that's a very unrealistic expectation for any marriage, even the healthiest of marriages. That's not happening. And so even though obviously your marriage is a place where you do get a lot of your needs met, and oftentimes very differently than in other relationships, there's a shared intimacy obviously in marriage that is unique to marriage, but it's not necessarily going to 100% take care of all of your needs. And so when we deal with this disappointment and sadness that comes with not having all of our needs met through that other person, then we fall into meaning ruts, what I call meaning ruts, right? So you don't love me, I'm not good enough, you're not good enough, I'm to blame, you're to blame. And we get into these classic kind of either I, you, blame patterns, which can be really damaging and may not be really based in much evidence at all. So it's like a cognitive distortion, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that another one is this idea that, well, this is more of a sexual one, but that the more intimacy and respect and friendship we have, the better off our sex life will be. And this is a big myth. So this is actually not really true at all. I mean, for some people, it works out that way. But I know wonderful, wonderful couples that just have deep friendships, deep respect, and are struggling significantly in their sex lives together and are very confused by that. Because again, since they bought into that myth, they go back to there must be something wrong, usually with me, because in those types of relationships, they love each other. They're not blaming each other, usually very much. So very self-beating up type of relationships. And I know people who have like really toxic, like I'm scared of them when they come in my office and I'm thinking, do I need to use the mace on them? Or, like just do I have Valium in my water? So I start wondering how I'm going to get them to settle down. And they're reporting like super hot sex, right? So they're a passionate couple. I mean, they're passionate in telling each other to F off, and they're also passionate in effing each other too, right? So trying to keep my my language somewhat decent for your show. So that doesn't mean that they're having, high levels of intimacy or, able to emotionally regulate very well in their relationship together. So that's another myth. And probably the last one I'll just touch on, so I just don't keep on talking for the 2 hours of the myths I could talk about is, men want sex more and women want emotion more. And that's a misnomer. So that more and more the research is coming out to show that there are many women who are unsatisfied with the frequency of sex in their marriages. And this idea that men are somehow less emotional than women or don't have emotional needs is also very convoluted and keeps us polarized in ways where we talk in general about this whole, men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And it's a very polarizing way to stereotypically wide brush issues that are much more complex than that. And that really, I think, sell both partners short. So we're all sexual in one way or another. We're all emotional in one way or another. And we're all logical in one way or another. And those things play out in our relationships in different ways for different reasons. So don't buy into those stereotypes.
Great.
Beautiful. So just for repetition's sake, repeat the myths one last time.
You're asking me to repeat what I pulled out of my head? Okay.
Oh, sorry. It's okay to add some.
Yeah.
I belong to you, you belong to me, therefore
That's
there's some
myth.
type of ownership.
What's a better way to say that?
Ownership?
Ownership, each owns their own life, so to speak.
Oh, what would be the reality, you mean?
Yeah, what would be a better...
Yes, I think the counter to that is I belong to me and you belong to you. And I'm choosing to share myself with you in very significant ways. And the more that we're able to be vulnerable and the more that it goes well when we're intimate with one another, the more that grows over time. And that's exciting. And there's times when I'm not going to be happy with your behavior or uncomfortable with your ideas or thoughts, but that doesn't need to challenge necessarily who I am. And it doesn't have to challenge the way I feel about you in regards to our marital contract.
Okay. We belong to ourselves, but we engage intently in this relationship. What's the second myth?
Shoot.
Was the second
was it the needs?
About, that you're
the needs.
Fulfill your needs 100% with one person.
Okay.
I better come with bullet points next time. which I loved you, John, because you helped me be more bullet oriented. I hope I help you be more abstract oriented, but you help me be more bullet.
So let's just reframe this because I'm uncomfortable with making you uncomfortable. We'll just select a few of the things you mentioned, and then we'll expand on like maybe a healthier way to think about it. Okay? So
Right. No, and that's fine.
Is 100%. Like you fulfill my needs in one.
Yeah.
And if any listener is listening and can list out the bullets that Natasha said, we're going to give them a bonus. Okay, go ahead, Natasha.
Ooh, a bonus.
And they'll help. The listeners will help us out.
Yeah, that will help us with is that dementia testing or something that you can repeat? So yeah, the needs one obviously is like, okay, if I'm getting a majority of my needs met in this relationship, and when I'm talking about needs, we're talking briefly like emotional needs, intellectual needs, spiritual needs, and physical needs. That's how I break them out. It's not like some major list. Anybody can come up with their own list. And by spiritual, I mean like moral, ethical needs, spirituality, how we're going to live, how we're going to be empowered by and enlightened by things. Intellectual needs, I mean, like, do we have things in common, hobbies, interests? Can we talk about politics or the current events or things that interest us both? Or are we just staring at each other across the way at dinner and not really know what to say to each other anymore? Yeah. Emotional needs is, are we able to share with each other how we feel, how our day is going, how we, our dreams, our ideas about life, and if I emote myself, is it safe to do that in whatever way I emote with you, and vice versa. And of course, physical is sexual, but also affection and holding hands and massage, and just how do we generally relate with our bodies with one another. It doesn't all have to be about sex, obviously. Yeah. So that's a general thing. So instead of feeling like all of those needs are going to be met by one particular person, if I always tell my couples, 65 to 75% of your needs are being met in any one of those particular areas, you can feel pretty good about that. And you can get your needs met also through other resources in your life, whether that's community or family or solo things that people do on their own, self-soothing techniques, for example, or self-hobbies. The one that's probably most challenging to most marriages is the physical one, because it's not like we have sex clubs we can go to. Well, we do have them, but most people don't engage in, instead of going to the book club tonight to get my needs met, I'm going to go to the sex club and get my needs met there, since you're not in the mood, right? So it's a little more challenging in the sexual field. Yeah.
Chelsea just wrote, Natasha is one of my favorite people I've ever met.
Oh, loves Chelsea.
Right. We get it. That's what we say. We get that.
Okay, this is good. All right, so we have another. I'm just going to keep reinforcing those who are submitting questions or comments either through the Facebook live stream or by emailing us at mormonstories@gmail.com. So instead of just going through our bulleted list, I'm going to read the next. I'm going to read the next question. So this is from an anonymous email. How do we break the cycle of judgment and Mormon expectations for a spouse after both have left the faith? Mormonism caused harsh judgment on what being a faithful wife means and what being a worthy priesthood holder means, not in the aspect of fidelity, but more so holding each other at such a high standard, and also the quote roles given in the church, a man being the breadwinner and the woman being the stay-at-home happy mother. So Margi, I'm going to throw this to you first.
Okay.
How do we break the cycle of judgment and Mormon expectations for a spouse after both have left the faith? And then Natasha will bring you in.
So I'm wondering if the people involved are on the same page, or if one is out and one is in. But what I would say is let's assume
both are out.
Both are out?
Yeah. But they've still got the Mormon brain of judgment and roles and expectations.
So actually, one of the things we were going to discuss today plays a little bit into this in a positive way.
Let's pull it in.
Because it talks about one of the positive principles to strong marriages is meaning, creating meaning with one another. And so I feel like sometimes when things stop working or we come to a place of renegotiation in marriage, there's this opportunity to recreate something that will be more apt and suitable with the place where you are. And so that's what I would say is maybe this could be a great time of reflection where you both come together and say, hey, what do we want in our life together? And do we have these expectations for one another? And what do they look like? And upon reflection and really discussing, do they seem healthy for us now? And do they and really maybe get to a place of creating and understanding where you both kind of stand and desire what you desire now, and see if you can't pull together a vision that represents and reflects both of you in a current place with you sharing some of those things. What I like about that is that it allows for growth. It allows for this expansion and this, what would I say, where you are truly being thoughtful about your own life and creating a marriage that reflects you and your values for now. So that's what I would say.
So I like to restate just for fun. It sounds like what you're saying is don't stay and remain in the vacuum of sort of post-Mormonism. Bring a deliberateness to your relationship, to your roles, to the life you want to live. Even enumerate your common values, what your expectations are or aren't. And some of those values may be lowering expectations. They may be chilling out and relaxing and not being so judgmental or uptight. And through more intentionality, this couple can move to a place where they're a lot less uptight, a lot less judgy, a lot less stressed out, and more following their values of, for example, being calm or relaxed or flexible. Is that what you're saying?
That is exactly what I'm saying.
All right. Natasha, what would you add?
You guys kind of crack me up, by the way. In a good way.
You make communication live and real. People.
That's right. Validation, communication, listening skills.
Yeah. So what would you add? What would you say?
All right. So I think that, I have a lot of thoughts as both the question and from what you shared, which I totally agree with. Nothing I would challenge there for sure. I think one of the tasks of going through a faith transition, and with as long as I've been doing this work, I really have thought through a lot of the different tasks that I think a faith transition requires, kind of like taking a developmental model to this idea of a faith transition. And one of those tasks is redefining your values.
Yep.
And so, and we talked about that last time, about going through this exercise where you can really start brainstorming about what are my values now, taking back your authority, right, from this very prescribed system, which we were all a part of. And not that everything in that system is bad. There's lots of great values that we grew up with as Mormons. So it's kind of like picking from that what we want to keep. I love Carolyn Pearson's pioneer type of poetry, right, where she talks about leaving the things that no longer serve us, but putting back in the cart the things that still serve us and moving forward from there. So you can do a lot of that work. And what I like too about that is it's now ongoing. It's not fixed. So to your point, Margi, it's something you should revisit often. It's not something that now I have my new manual and now I'm stuck with that manual and I can't move from it. It's like, this is what I believe now, with the idea that that could shift 2 to 3 to 10 years from now as well. So this is an ongoing process. I think another task is obviously recontracting your marriage. And not that marriages were ever really contracted to begin with, but we come to marriage with a lot of assumptions about a lot of these things, gender roles, expectations, who should do what. And sometimes those things fit really well. Some households manage themselves very well with very structured systems. And as you're moving away from Mormonism, sometimes that can feel like, well, I now consider myself a feminist. What does that mean for my role as a stay-at-home mother, for example, right? Or I now consider myself an LGBT ally. How does that support my ideas about how I'm relating with my mixed orientation spouse, marriage, right? So all of these very complex things that now actually bring what I love, which is ethics.
Right.
Ethics. Okay, so I think sometimes in Mormonism, we forget that religion is bound with ethics. We're so focused on following the laws and the rules that we forget that every interesting story in the scripture is an ethical dilemma. And it requires us to look at rules and look at exceptions to the rules, and when do you follow the rule and when do you not, and how does that fit into my personal story in life? That's what makes a scripture story interesting. So I think we can take a lot of that to these tasks. What I would add to that is this idea that it's going to take patience and time to shift. And I would give the idea of a code word, because you'll catch each other. You'll catch each other either being too patriarchal or being too obedience focused or these kinds of things. And instead of being really grumpy at each other and pointing those out in really blame shaming ways, you can maybe come up with a code word. And this is Gottman's principle of influencing each other, allowing your spouse to influence you so that you can now inject humor. So if your code word is like white salamander, right? Or red flamingo or whatever, it can be Mormon Zelf. Or not Mormon or Zelf. And you can kind of give it with a wink and kind of like a little smirky, flirtatious look. All of a sudden you've injected humor into a difficult situation. Like, hey, I'm catching you in our old habits that we just had a conversation about a month ago or 2 weeks ago that we both agreed on. We don't want to do that. But we understand that we're creatures of habit and that this is going to take time. So I'm kind of lovingly and with humor calling you out on that. And it doesn't have to turn into a much bigger deal than that.
Right.
So I don't think this is a tangent, but I do want to touch on this because this is something that just came up for me like 3 times this week with couples, and I've been thinking a lot about it. This idea of moving away from Mormonism. First of all, I want to say it's not everything in Mormonism was bad, so we don't want to get super black and white about that. We like black and white. Just because you're no longer Mormon or consider yourself a transitioning Mormon, there's still a lot of black and white about us. And so I've seen this both in the sexual shame, and I've seen this both in what I call like feminist shame. And what I mean by feminist shame is this idea that how can I be a woman and have put up with all of this ways that I was, a subordinate in the system for so long, when I considered myself intellectual and smart and witty and, capable. How did I put up with that for so long? So those 2 areas come with a lot of pain. And when people start understanding how shame affected them, both either sexually or in these kind of gender roles, feminist attributes, there's a lot of anger. And there's a lot of betrayal, and there's a lot of grief work that needs to go into how their whole lives were affected by those types of ideas. Well, guess who gets the brunt of that day to day? Your spouse. Mm-hmm. Because you are in patterns with that spouse that may or may not be part of that shame, kind of rhetoric. So if your spouse, for example, isn't comfortable with you looking at pornography, right? Or your spouse is still calling you sweetie.
What's wrong with sweetie?
Well, like
Sweetie's
Margi just
awesome.
role modeled so well after the 4th sweet comment from John. Is, hey, I'm more than just, it's okay to call me sweet, but let's not be the only way that you describe me, right? And so those are kind of some examples of, we can still have our own feelings and systems and discomforts and boundaries and betrayals within our own marriage that need to be worked out with some sort of grace period that separates it from the work we need to do with the church.
Mm-hmm.
Because oftentimes I see these kind of ultimatums like, well, I was sexually shamed by the church for 50 years. I'm not going to allow you to do that to me anymore. So you need to be okay with anything I want to do sexually.
Right.
That's not necessarily like, this is okay to deal with this, but that's not necessarily how it's going to be realistic to deal with your spouse.
Right.
Or I'm so sick of being treated like a subordinate. You can no longer ever make a decision in my life again, or I need to be completely independent, make all the decisions, right? So we take these very polarized approaches to very hurtful issues that have affected most of us. So I just want to caution couples around those dynamics.
Yeah. Very wise. Very wise.
I'll try and chill out on the sweetie.
Well, you added other adjectives. It was awesome. Nice job. Okay.
You call me sweetie.
I do, among other things.
All right. So now that we've talked about some of the common myths, Margi wanted to begin with maybe just a few sort of, let's just call them positive principles to enhance marriage. And the first one that Margi brought up was cultivate friendship. And this is something that I think when Gottman really boils down.
Here's the book.
So this is one of our favorite books, The 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work by John Gottman. There it is, PhD. It seems like the main thing he says to sort of focus on to have a healthy marriage is to really focus on becoming best friends, close friends, to really connect and cultivate that friendship. Because just think about it for a second. If something good happens to you and the very first person you want to call to tell instinctively is your partner, or if something terrible happens and the first person you want to vent and share with is your partner, and if you've got some free time and the first person you want to hang out with is your partner because they're the person you enjoy the most, those things aren't always required to have a healthy marriage, but they're probably a good sign that you have a good relationship and that you're doing something right. So Margi, talk about cultivating friendship for a second.
Sure. Okay. So a couple of the first principles that John Gottman kind of begins the book with are the idea of enhancing your love map. That's kind of the name of the chapter. And the basic idea behind this, I believe actually in the chapter, he has questions that you can answer or ask each other to sort of get this idea of, how well you know your partner. And they have kind of deep questions and not so deep questions and current questions and things kind of from the past. But it's this great way to connect in a deeper way with your spouse on sort of this friendship level. And I feel like kind of the basic idea behind it amidst other things would be that knowing your partner well strengthens your marriage. What you know well, in the end, it allows for you to understand better, to have context, to show generosity and trust a bit more. And so, that's one of the first principles is enhance your love map.
Enhance your love map. Anything to add to that, Natasha?
No, I love that description. I think it's just really, do you know the details of your partner's life? Are you intimately involved in the day-to-day? And this is something that we do a lot when we're dating, right? Mm-hmm. It's kind of a natural get to know you process. And then life gets in the way, right? So kids and finances and stressors. And so we kind of we think we still know each other, but we're changing all along the way. And so it's really important to figure these things out and still talk to each other on a regular basis. Great activity for date night, etc.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Love it. Okay, the next one is nurture kindness and admiration. What might that be?
Yeah, so I think this is maybe the second sort of chapter, but I think it goes along with sort of the friendship idea. Do you ever notice with couples, and I've noticed even with us, there are times when you slip into more of a business model, life kind of gets busy and your conversations tend to start reflecting that of what needs to be done for the day. And so I love the idea of nurturing kindness and admiration as sort of a daily practice, something that you're kind of aware of. So an idea behind this too is one of the enemies or one of the major obstacles to a healthy marriage is contempt. And that's another reason why I think there's this focus on kindness and respect and admiration is it's very hard to show contempt, which is like, you know, this level of like condescension, disrespect, when you're really connected to your spouse in this way on a daily basis. And so one idea I remember from the chapter was this idea of looking for positives, right, on a daily basis. And most people think, oh, what I'm doing is I'm really focusing on the positive. So I'm going to see my relationship in this really positive way. But what John Gottman asserts is actually by looking for the positives, you're seeing your marriage in a more realistic way. Because as human beings, what we naturally tend to do is see the things that are going wrong. We tend to be critical and notice those things that are off. So that idea of being positive on a daily level, being grateful, appreciating our spouse on these things actually allows for the set point or what we see to be a more accurate reflection than otherwise it would be. And then there are other ideas like the emotional bank account. I feel like that's kind of a common concept, but that on a daily basis kind of falls under the nurture kindness and admiration.
Make sure you're making more credit deposits than withdrawals from the emotional bank account, right?
Yeah, just really looking at each other like the closest people, we're going to take care of them and treat them really well, you know, on a daily basis with kindness and admiration. So
yeah, and if I'm just thinking to our relationship, Margi is super good. You're really good at doing nurturing things. So Margi will, you know, just every once in a while, she'll bring me down a lunch or a snack, or she'll remind me to take my vitamins, you know, something I want to do. Sometimes she'll just say, lie down right now on the couch and I'm giving you a 3-minute massage, and she'll just do it. And it's really nice when Margi's nurturing, just because it makes us have more tender feelings towards each other than, again, like you said, just always being business-minded and sort of getting through the day in a mechanical way.
yeah.
And I'm trying to be more nurturing.
Yes. Well, let me answer that bid. I feel like that was a bid. You're very nurturing. So some ways that John is nurturing me are that I oftentimes have a hard time settling down at the end of day, and you'll do my back. He scratches my back before I go to sleep every night. Or I really love this certain type of chocolate in Cache Valley, chocolate makers. And
Dark chocolate covered orange creams.
I know.
Ooh.
Alvy's. If you ever want to get on Margi's good list, Alvy's dark chocolate orange creams.
They don't sound amazing, but they are amazing. They are. So anyway, he'll run out and get me chocolates just because. Or, I mean, really, honestly, it's like doing the dishes after dinner. Or, I mean, it's really not anything extravagant, but it's being aware of each other and kind of doing those small things to show that awareness and that kindness and, you know, admiration for one another. Natasha, did you have anything to say about that?
I will just add, so to understand a little bit of the evolutionary theory or biology behind some of this and why this is important as far as what you're talking about, how we pay attention to negatives versus positives.
Yeah.
We are wired to pick out the negatives because that's a defense mechanism, right? So imagine back in the day, or when you think of a deer in the middle of the field, the deer is not so much attuned to all the grass. I mean, it's eating the grass, but what it's really attuned to is the danger signal, right? Because as soon as there's a snap of a twig or any little tiny thing, it's going to make a run for it because its life depends on it. So we're somewhat similar, and why it's so easy to fall into this habit of figuring out all the negatives, and then we become very catastrophic in our thinking. We forget the evidence on the other side. Again, the red tulip is easier to pick out in the yellow field, and it is important to be mindful and intentional about remembering the many positives that our partner has. Another thought I had was it's very easy to know what we want and to feel sad that we're not getting what we want. oftentimes my biggest challenges to myself have been, am I offering what I want? And sadly, my evaluation of that has not gone as well as I would like to think it would go. So, I don't want to be judged. I don't want to be controlled. I don't want somebody to expect certain things of me or to see my failures in a certain way. But it's much easier for me to not necessarily offer that in return to my spouse. And so that's, am I offering what I would like to receive? Sometimes people are, and there's just a difference in, I think, emotional intelligence or in skills as far as, so there are legitimate ways that sometimes people offer things that they don't necessarily get back. And that's kind of a different issue. But I think in general, we could all use that mantra a little bit.
Yeah.
One last thing I'll say, just to wrap up the friendship idea, because I love the friendship idea, but I've always got to kind of keep it a little real.
Yeah.
And this is the idea that friends, you don't have sex with your best friend usually. When you think about your friend that you grew up with that was like your best friend, most people did not fall in love with that person. Okay, so friendship is not always super erotic. So we want a level of friendship. We want a level of respect, obviously, in a marriage. And this kind of goes to Esther Perel's work, where she's really got some good language to be able to talk about, we all want stability, which is kind of friendship. You know your friend, you can count on your friend, count on me, right? The classic friend song is all about, you can count on me, I'm there, I'm dependable. Not super sexy. We also want mystery and eroticism.
Yeah.
So it is important, if you should be building most of your foundation on a friendship,
Right,
to keep it a little exciting and erotic also by creating some mystery in your relationship. And to not always, I'm always a little cringy when I'm like, I'm marrying my best friend. And I'm sorry, because I really don't want to judge anybody who thinks that's really important. I just don't want it to be all about friendship.
sure.
Because I've got a lot of best friends I would never have sex with.
Got it.
How many?
Well, you are one of them, John. You are one of my best friends that I'm not planning on having sex with. And Margie.
See how she said no plans. She is
No plans.
planning.
No
That's the
plans.
mystery part. That's the
Right,
mystery
I see,
part. It's
I
like,
see.
You're not fitting my erotic template, you guys. I'm sorry.
so what I was going to ask you then, just as a quick follow-up is, so what would that look like? What does the mystery component, is that the element of surprise? What is the mystery component within a relationship? Let's say the foundation is healthy communication and what we're talking about, like the friendship as sort of a base, but you want a little mystery.
Right. Well, I do think that obviously some of this can be just planned, like surprising your partner with things. But I think it can go a little bit deeper than that, in that I'm not sure that my husband knows every single thing about me.
Yes.
Or every single thought about me.
Yes.
And I'm perfectly comfortable with that. And vice versa. And I think sometimes, especially coming from our Mormon culture and with our values being so much about honesty and transparency, and, bishops' interviews where they ask you all these questions and you're supposed to answer everything, we forget that we have a right to our own personal privacy. And even in my marriage, and even with my friendship with my spouse, I'm somewhat private as well, and that's okay.
I love that. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of differentiation, in that you're both out in the world pursuing your own lives as well, and your own, and I think being changed and hopefully developing and growing. And then you come and you return back to one another at the end of day. And there are certain things that are reflected in the relationship of those things that you've seen and done. I think it adds oxygen really to a relationship, and others may not. And I just love that idea of, I don't know, that we're our own entities too. And it takes away that ownership kind of part. Like, I know John, I know him, I could tell you, versus like allowing for a little bit of, Exactly.
It does go back to that myth of I own you, and therefore I own all your information, or you're somehow being deceitful if you don't share every single detail of your life with me. And Yeah.
Exactly.
All right, let's check in with our live listeners. Jana wants to remind us not only of Alvy's chocolates, but of Bluebird chocolates in Logan. That's true. We like Alvy's more than Bluebird, right?
Well, with this particular chocolate,
Yeah.
yes.
But yes, Jana, thank you for the reminder about Bluebird chocolates.
That
Jana,
was very mysterious of you, Margie, by the way.
I am so mysterious.
Jana also writes, "Oh, Natasha, you are so great." Laughing about that comment from John and Margie not fitting in your erotic zone.
We don't? What?
I'm sorry if that's offensive.
Wow,
If I fit into yours, I'd like to know.
Yeah, you left Margie
kidding.
out. You left Margie out of your comment about
erotic zone. No, actually, I did include her, John. I don't know what you're trying to push here, but I'm on you.
It was both of us. All right. All right.
He's got you.
Two other comments or questions coming in. Natasha, I'm curious how you would respond. Joyce writes, in multiple decades of marriage, lowering expectations leads to less disappointment. She talks about, maybe a spouse could be emotionally stifled, for example, and maybe if you lower your expectations, you're a little less sad all the time. What would your response to Joyce be on that?
I agree with that. I think that's a very wise thing to say. You have to remember, for example, I've worked a lot with high-level autism, high spectrum autism folks that usually get dragged into therapy by a very sad, disappointed spouse. They usually connect very well. Intellectual intimacy is usually high in that type of partnership. If they're, if they come from Mormonism, spiritual intimacy can be high just because they share a religion and kind of a lifestyle. Physical intimacy can be a really mixed bag for high-level autistic people, and emotional intimacy is usually not super great. So yes, each person comes with their own skill set. We come with our own baggage. We come with our own family culture. We come with things that we're good at and things that we're not as great at. Hopefully, most of us are willing to step into discomfort at some level to help our spouse feel like their needs are being met a little bit more than they would organically be met. However, at the basis of marital therapy, when it comes for me to an individual, is if your partner stayed as is and never changed, what would you do then? Because then it really comes back to the only thing that you can control, which is yourself.
Right.
And it sounds like this particular person dealt with that question by saying, well, I might lower some of my expectations. By doing that, now we have more marital accord. Maybe she's getting some of her needs met in other areas of her life with other people or other things, interests. And the general, again, how much is this relationship still worth it to me? Now, some people get to that question and kind of like what we talked about last time too, they'll say, well, that's a deal breaker for me. That's not sustainable for me to be able to live in this type of environment. And that's a legitimate exploration as well. So these are all explorations.
Yeah.
Love it. All right. Another email that came in, again, email us at mormonstories@gmail.com. This person messaged me through the Mormon Stories podcast Facebook page. She writes, this is for Natasha. Do you see a connection with the LDS Church and narcissism? She writes that she sees narcissistic traits in her husband after 15 years of feeling crazy. She says, I can see that it all adds up now. It makes sense. I feel like I can't have a relationship with the church because of its own narcissism. Can I have a relationship with my husband, or will I always feel this trapped like I did with the church? I had to get away from it. I am afraid I won't be able to live with my husband without always feeling sad and crazy. Is there help for a semi-narcissistic man and a faith crisis in a woman creating a mixed faith marriage? Can we survive? All right, Natasha, the heat's on you. Is the Mormon Church narcissistic?
Narcissistic.
Can this person's marriage survive with a semi-narcissistic husband?
Well, many marriages do survive with all kinds of different personality disorders. So yes, it can. It's challenging. And of course, these types of, I have a love-hate relationship with personality disorders. On the one hand,
You mean the diagnosis?
yes, the diagnoses. On the one hand, they can be extremely helpful, especially for people who are living with somebody who is chronically difficult and toxic in their family system, to be like, oh, we weren't all crazy. You know, there are actual criteria here, and this person seems to meet a lot of these criteria, et cetera. At the same time, I do believe we throw out these words kind of like candy, like we do with a lot of words, addiction and depression and anxiety and OCD even. I mean, there's a big difference between having a trait or having a stereotype versus having a full-blown disorder. Now, the church, yes, the church has some unhealthy cultural parameters for sure. And it is acting in very relationally unhealthy ways with its members. It's very authoritarian. Mm-hmm. It's very obedience focused. It treats us all like we're chronically adolescent in our developmental stage. And it allows for, you know, it's my way or the highway, which is oftentimes how personality disorders, you know, play out. So there's a lot of rigidity. Would I diagnose the church with narcissistic personality disorder? I don't know about that. Yeah. Are there traits? Yes. And one of the things that I actually really liked about the changes in the DSM-5, which is our mental health Bible per se, is that they are moving towards the possibility of, instead of saying, yes, you have a personality disorder, no, you don't, you know, like it's a yes or no, it's more of like a spectrum. Yeah. So that you might have some traits, mild traits, moderate traits, severe traits. Because I think most of us can read through a personality disorder diagnosis criteria, and we would all fit in probably each one at some very small amount, at least, if that makes sense. So we want to be careful with throwing around these words. This is a tough one in patriarchy, because I do believe the guest is correct in that narcissism in men, or narcissistic traits in men, can be rewarded in our LDS system. So that idea of power, and I'm important and I'm correct and I have the priesthood and therefore what I say goes, and I'm important and grandiose, and all those types of issues that come with narcissism can definitely be played into by the LDS culture. The LDS culture isn't necessarily going to challenge that, at least not in men. So, but then it's hard for me to know how to assess, because I also would be interested in how angry she is, to my point previously about feminist issues. How's her own anger and grief cycle about that playing into how she responds to her husband, who he may be like a deer in the headlights, like, I'm just acting like I've always acted, and I don't know what you're so upset about. And I thought I was being super loving. So it would require more assessment, obviously, from my part, to be able to say whether or not those things are really playing out in a clinical way. Mm-hmm. But to just be aware that she might also be hypervigilant to those types of dynamics because she's so angry. And which will help her. I think anger always informs us. It will help her create boundaries. It will help, and she's going to be changing a dance. Well, what happens when you change a dance? You step on toes, right? And what do people do? Well, they squawk. They don't like changing the dance. Even if they're intellectually on board with you, changing the toes and the feet and how they move is complicated. And so you will get resistance. And if you see that resistance as part of narcissism, maybe not. Maybe that's just a normal reaction to change and to getting used to a whole new system that they're trying to navigate together. I do recommend, I think the book is called Walking on Eggshells, or How to Stop Walking on Eggshells. I'll look it up later and maybe add it to I can't find it on my bookshelf right now, but it's actually how to help family systems deal with borderline personality disorder. But I find a lot of the strategies in there really helpful, regardless of what the personality disorder is.
Terrific.
Love it. So there is hope, you're saying.
Well, sure, there's hope, and then there's exploration.
Yep.
And then there's time frames. And 10 years down the road, she may feel less hopeful or pretty satisfied.
Right.
Natasha, are you aware of someone who let's just say, had narcissistic features who was able to make substantive, meaningful change once it was brought to their attention and they sought support?
Well, the statistics on personality disorders are not great. At the same time, I want to be careful about that because I want to also make sure that we make room for the fact that the mental health profession has been telling everybody that it's not great for the last 30 years, and how that what implications that has on both people who have these disorders. I think that it is unrealistic to think that somebody who has a full-blown personality disorder will never have any of those traits ever again. I think that's unrealistic because that's a personality, and personalities don't necessarily change. However, insights can change, and I have seen, I would say, a few people that I would say made significant behavioral or emotional modifications for their spouse and their children to be able to tolerate and sustain the relationships. Yes.
It's also possible that, a spouse can say, well, my spouse is narcissistic, when really they're just kind of selfish. And not everyone who's selfish has narcissistic personality disorder. And so, again, I guess I'm just reflecting what you said when you started, which is we have to be careful with these diagnoses. Again, somebody who has high anxiety or even is really meticulous doesn't necessarily have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. That's a totally different realm. And so I agree with you that we should be careful using some of these more severe terms. And I would just say that selfishness is a lot more treatable than narcissistic personality disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And make sure we're not confusing one for the other.
And for those who are interested in seeking out treatment, the DBT, so dialectical behavioral therapy, has shown really good results with borderline personality disorder and some other personality disorders as well. Yep. So I would recommend that.
And that question actually kind of plays into the power differential sort of element that I was curious about exploring with you last time, Natasha, because it's also one of the chapters in the book by Gottman, in that he talks about letting your partner influence you, how that is important. And one thing that just kind of popped out at me as I was reading was this. I'll actually quote it from the book, that when a male in particular, and it's interesting because in that chapter, he kind of does target, I feel like, males in particular. When a male fails to share power with his partner, there is an 81% chance the marriage will fail. So the idea of influencing, and I'm wondering how you feel about why he may focus on males in particular. He explains it a little bit, but I'd be curious kind of your take on it and what you feel about that. Because I was thinking as she was asking that question, if what she means by narcissism is she really doesn't feel like she can infiltrate his psyche or really communicate in a way that touches him or influence him, that may be a larger issue.
Well, so I'll just talk about my own experience as to why I would support what he's saying. We just don't live in a world anymore where you can get away with that behavior, quite frankly. I had a family member who is elderly and on, a second marriage, approach me one time and say, the rules totally changed on me halfway. So what I saw my father and my grandfather role modeling as far as what type of relationship, being the patriarch especially, and being in charge and being the responsible one, that came with a certain marital style that wasn't really helping him have emotional intimacy, have physical intimacy, these kinds of things that and back maybe 200 years ago, not that women ever liked being treated subordinately, but we allowed for it more as a culture so you could get away with it more. I see a huge disparity even in my mother's aged women and my daughter's age, as far as peers, what they're willing to see. And what I see a lot of times with the older, like 60 and above, is that they're seeing the things that the younger generations are doing, the females are, and almost like I see a sense of bitterness or rage that they were not able to have those types of egalitarian relationships often, or that they missed out on many opportunities or dreams that they had, because not only maybe the church, but also the time in our history was not super indicated for women to be self-asserting and, things of that nature. So it is a complex, I think, cultural and historic question. And it goes the other way too, I think, but this is kind of what I was talking about last time too, is that women who assert power and have like a placating spouse, although I think just as unhealthy,
right,
just as unhealthy, it's more tolerated in our society, because I do believe we have this springboard, since we do live overall in patriarchy. You can get away with negative things in the matriarchal things that you wouldn't be able to get away with anymore in patriarchy, if that makes sense, because it's almost like it's having to recalibrate. And so if you see a woman bossing her husband around, or being super like, well, you're not going to do that, or I kind of run the pants in the family, that's almost seen as quirky or fun or cute.
Got it.
Where a man doing that, we're all kind of, are we ready to call the police or something if we see somebody exerting power over a woman inappropriately, especially in a public space, right? So, of course, many of these things happen in the privacy of people's own homes. But yes, power differentials are really fascinating and important. And even myself having to think about, because, I transitioned really from that whole idea of being a stay-at-home mom and doing my gender role. And I wanted my career, so I was kind of dabbled in that, but it was always very minimal compared to the time I was spending as a stay-at-home mother. And as that has shifted, even have to dealing with some of the legalities involved, right? Like if my husband and I were to divorce now versus 20 years ago, I would be held more financially responsible for our finances, things that even as a feminist make me uncomfortable. And I'm not even sure are fair when I think about them personally, right? Like, well, what about all the work I did with the kids that my husband didn't have to do, right? Or all of those things that are just tricky. They get tricky when we're having to all of us shift in what we expected, what we thought we were maybe what we felt we deserved as a woman or as a man in a certain relationship, the amount of time and energy we've put in these relationships versus what we feel we've gotten out. I mean, these are tricky things.
Yeah. Yep.
But do you want to add more as far as what Gottman would have said to answer your question?
I think what you're saying totally makes sense. The main point I wanted to bring out just in that with the having your partner influence, and I love it going both ways, this sort of emotional connection that you have, that you can communicate emotional things and share insights, and that they're felt for one another. That he talks about how there's less control in those relationships, less control issues, less authoritative kind of speaking. And he does focus on men, but one interesting aspect of that was he was saying how they make better fathers because they can communicate a spectrum of emotions and can hold those emotions comfortably with their children as well. So it benefits the marriage, but it also benefits the family. And I thought this would be funny to do, because in this part that says research shows a husband who can accept influence from his wife also tends to be an outstanding father, meaning he's familiar with his children's world, including their friends and their fears. I wrote, John, in the margin. Wait, is it over here? I don't know if you can see the John, but it's showing up on there. But there's a John. Anyway, I just thought it would be cute.
I did something good.
Well, and what I want to also be very careful about, because we can be very blaming of men in patriarchy and authority, but I want to go back to my family member who I really could empathize with. We, as a culture, have shut down little boys emotionally from day one.
Yes.
We tell them not to cry, don't be a sissy, man up, cowboy up, all of these things. This is why men are not less emotional. They've just been expected to, contain their emotions differently than women. And so for us now to be like, oh, you're the narcissist, you're the patriarch, you're basically the asshole in the relationship. Well, you have to kind of take the cultural context into play, because many of our husbands and fathers and grandfathers have not had the type of role modeling where they would have learned these skills to begin with. So can we allow, as we're making huge, I hope, progress, in this movement towards more egalitarian relationships, that in a sense, as women, we've been given a heads up in that we were allowed emotional communication from a very early age, and that men, in a sense, need some help catching up to that.
I love that thought. And it reminds me of Brene Brown. I think I watched in one of her TED Talks or an interview, she brought up that idea of talking. I think a male came up to her after a talk at a bookstore and said, the women in my life could not handle me being vulnerable. And I think that's an important point, that we also have to work to be really safe for each other, to be vulnerable, to show that type of vulnerability in our men and with our boys and sons, that we allow them to cultivate language and safety around sharing their full emotional experiences. So love that.
I'm sorry, go ahead, John.
I just want to add really quickly that when we talk about this person you talked about, Natasha, who said, oh, the rules changed on me and I can't be sort of 50s style patriarchal anymore. I like this idea that we heard from a podcast once, that you're always going to be in at least 3 marriages. Now that may be to the same person or to a different person, but you're always going to have at least 3. And I think setting that expectation that we kind of think, oh, well, we'll have this wonderful thing that'll last forever, or this awful thing that'll last forever, or this wonderful thing that becomes awful and then lasts forever. But part of that is
many awesome options. Yes.
But part of that is because we're not in this expectation of renovation and self-discovery. And so, yes, it may be that the patriarchal sort of chauvinistic tendencies you learned from your, post-World War II father, doesn't cut it 20 years into your marriage once your wife becomes enlightened to feminism and you both leave the church and all of a sudden she becomes aware of and starts exercising her own power. But that's okay. That's this brilliant opportunity to renovate the relationship, to discover, to learn new things about each other, to almost be married to a different person, and to reap all the joy and the benefits of that discovery and of that retooling of the relationship. What's wrong with remodeling a house every 15 years? Every woman and probably many men would love to see that happen. Why should a marriage be any different?
Love it.
I love that. Yes, absolutely. I love the 3 marriage approach. We're living longer than ever. So that's a good metaphor.
Our marriages are having to last longer and go through changes. I feel like it's like minimal is 3, honestly, because truly just look at the difference between when you're first married, no children, then add children, fundamentally different things going on in the marriage there, to empty nest, to midlife crisis.
Or even young children to teenage children.
And if you think about it, the relationship, like oftentimes when you marry someone, oftentimes you're, especially within the Mormon realm, what type of mother you'll be, and that is paramount. But then you hit 45 and you want a companion. You actually are thinking, now I really want a friend. And this is something that I think we all, with a little bit of awareness, can look at and say, how can we develop these parts of our relationship and change and grow to meet different circumstances? And that it's that expectation thing versus the stagnant we're in. All right.
Kimberly writes, preach Margi.
Oh.
Well, one of the things I was going to say, I think one of my most vulnerable moments with myself as I was thinking about the gender roles my husband and I play, and it even feeds into this article that came out this last week that I wasn't super thrilled about, a wife dealing with porn addiction with her husband. I'd go that with addiction because I don't, anyway. This idea that men are to protect and provide and preside. She used those 3 P words. And although, there's a part of me, very feminist part of me that would say, oh, that's an awful way to portray men. Again, in my lived experience, I had to really look at, but I do like feeling protected. I do like, sometimes having that man where I don't ever feel like I have to make a decision on my own that isn't flanked, right? And so it was really interesting for me to start thinking about, and this probably happened for me about 10 or 12 years ago. Oh, and I'm going to get emotional about it. I can't believe this.
Oh. Stop. Nope. None of that. None of that.
What would it feel like for my husband to feel protected? What would it be like for my husband to feel presided over by his wife? Right. And provided for.
Natasha, I love that.
And it really just shifted my whole paradigm. Like I was counting on him for too much. And as feminist as I was in my intellect, I wasn't having it really sift through my life in a way that I could really honor him and in this kind of new way that was really egalitarian, and I think that has really shifted my whole way of looking at, at least how I see my marriage.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
I really love that.
Oh, and I'm just going to add really quick, because this does not mean sexual stuff. So
I was going to say, will you preside over me?
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that erotic templates are not always egalitarian, and they're not super politically correct. So I can be a super feminist and everything like that, but in bed I'm like, take me, I'm the submissive one, right? And that's okay, because it doesn't need to be politically correct. I mean, I can challenge some of that if I want to play with more domineering roles, but I don't have to. Like, it can be okay to go back to gender roles and have fun with that in your sex life.
Absolutely. Fabulous.
Love it. All right.
Should we move to predictors of a divorce?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of stuff on our list that we won't get to, but maybe we can end with the 4 horsemen. Natasha, you've done a lot of speaking about the 4 horsemen. Tell us about what they're predictors of, and then talk about each one briefly, if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, they're predictors of divorce, right? And Gottman's whole claim to fame is that he can, predict divorce with like 90% accuracy after having, assessed or evaluated a couple for a few days, which he does in the Love Lab in Seattle, where he does all his studies, which he's done really excellent work. So one of the really great marriage therapists who was able to not only take these concepts, but really measure them and put them into practice in a very, evidence-based type of model, which is really great. So the 4 horsemen are, if I can remember off the top of my head, is criticism, contempt, stonewalling, and defensiveness. Okay, so really quick, just to describe them all. Contempt is different than, critique, being critical, is different than complaining. So this doesn't mean that you can't ever have a complaint. We're going to have tons of complaints. We're going to, be upset and annoyed and want things to change and shift, and that's perfectly normal. Contempt or critique is more about adding value to now the person. So very classic example is a complaint would be, I'm really disappointed that you didn't take out the trash when you said you would. Right? That's a complaint. Critique would be like, what's wrong with you? You're so lazy. You never take out the trash. So now we've added value to the person's kind of, personal worth, right?
Right.
Now, both are probably going to elicit some level of defensiveness, because nobody likes to be reminded that they forgot to take out the trash. But the second one, the critique, is going to elicit a lot more defensiveness, because now not only do I have to defend my not taking out the trash behavior, but I have to defend my whole character. and I'm probably going to do that somewhat by bringing up your character flaws, and then we're off to the races, right? So learning how to emotionally regulate can be a big part of learning how to handle complaints as well. Like, okay, yeah, I can look at weaknesses that I have without blowing a gasket. Contempt is, my classic emoji for contempt is the eye roll.
Right.
So it's kind of like that, I can't even believe that I'm in this position, with you. And I am obviously so much better than you, in this particular issue. Like, I've got it all figured out, right? And we all do it. I think about the times I rolled to my husband, and I'm like, oh my Lanta, you'd think I would have read Gottman 20 years ago, which I did, and still do this. But anyway, so we all do it, but it's good to repair, and there's good ways to kind of get out of that. But that idea that somehow my position is better than yours, and can't even begin to fathom how you can have that position. And so this really builds into disrespect. Yeah. Which that's a real danger zone for a couple, when I don't respect your positions or your character or the way you think or the way you are. Right. Defensiveness is obviously how we respond to these things, right? So we defend ourselves instead of taking the time to validate or be able to see it from another person's perspective. It's, no, I've got to defend my turf, my territory. I'm not willing to listen to your things, or I'm hurting, or I'm angry, and so I'm going to defend myself. And oftentimes conversations are just going right past each other. Because you can't even listen to what each other is saying, and you both are feeling more hurt and more upset over time. Yeah. Stonewalling is usually when somebody floods. So flooding is an interesting term. And as Gottman is describing these couples that he's watching, you can see the couples that are very agitated, but there are times when one person is like, ah, and the other person is all stoic. And they seem very calm. Well, they're measuring your heart rate. And usually that person's heart rate and emotional regulation is actually worse than the person who seems all agitated. Yeah. And that is a sign of flooding. So in other words, I'm so flooded by the emotional distress that I'm feeling as you're complaining and carrying on, or whatever it is that you're doing that I can't manage, that I will now check out. Yeah. And that's what stonewalling is. So it's kind of when the eyes glaze over, or I actually leave the room, or I refuse to talk with you. This can become a very typical pattern in what I call pursuer-withdrawer relationships. So most of us have a tendency to either be a pursuer or a withdrawer, and each marriage is different on that. But usually the withdrawers are the ones who are flooding and stepping out. And then what does the other person do? Their anxiety goes up, and so they pursue, which makes it even worse. And so, you go again round and round on these. And then the meanings that are attributed to it, right? Well, you don't care. You're not staying engaged. You're not prioritizing me. You're not staying up till 4:00 in the morning. Because remember, we're never supposed to go to bed angry, stupid as the advice ever. So it's just all these things that then lead to if you do this chronically enough, well, you can see how the meaning now has deteriorated the foundation of that relationship. You don't respect me. You don't, you're not, you don't have gratitude for me, right? You take me for granted. We have these huge blowouts that nothing gets resolved. Yeah. It becomes an unsustainable relationship.
Yep.
Love it.
Yep.
So did that cover the 4?
That's the 4 horsemen.
That's the 4 horsemen.
Yep.
Thanks to John Gottman, and summarized gratefully by Natasha Helfer Parker.
That sounded so formal.
Yeah.
Like the end of a little research paper or something.
Yeah, right.
That's my training coming into play. All right. Any other, Margi, you had a few final things you wanted to mention. We've got a few minutes left. Do you want to
For the predictors of divorce.
Yeah. Is there anything else you want to?
One thing I love, just because it feels like it's super practical. Another predictor of divorce is the idea of a failed repair attempt. So oftentimes you'll see amidst a disagreement, one spouse either try to make a joke or maybe dial down a little bit, or to reach out and even physically maybe touch the spouse, and one thing that I've really focused on doing when we have disagreements is to not only to give a repair attempt, first of all, to try and provide those, but also when he reaches out in any way to try to repair or dial down, that you want to reinforce that as much as possible, that failed repair attempts are a predictor of divorce as well. So repeatedly, when you're trying to sort of heal or bring things back to a level where you can communicate effectively again and feel those positive centering feelings around one another, that it's just a no-go.
So if your partner reaches out to you to try and fix things, repair things, try not to reject their bid. Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Now, what if...
And to see it as a repair attempt.
Exactly, to see
the
reaching out of the hand.
That's what I failed on that for a long time, because my husband's repair attempts is usually through humor.
Yes.
So what would I do? You're not taking this seriously.
That's right.
You're even more of a jerk because, now you've taken my complaint and made fun of it. And it really was through Gottman's work that I started shifting that and recognizing, no, that's a olive branch, and maybe it's not the olive branch I'd prefer, but it's an olive branch and I need to take it, or else I'm definitely a big part of the problem too.
Now, sometimes because I think Margie's a little more careful in day-to-day behavior, and I'm maybe a little bit less careful. I may step over boundaries a little more than she does. And the flip of that is that maybe I'm maybe a little bit more fast sometimes to forgive or move on. And maybe sometimes that can, for some people can take longer. And so what if your partner is ready to make up and makes those bids, but you're still angry? What if you're not ready to make up and you don't feel good and you don't want to make nice?
Well,
and they're making the
bid.
bid.
What would you say, Natasha? That doesn't feel like me. Like I really don't love conflict. So if I see a bid, I try to...
No, I'm not saying that's you.
I'm
just saying, what if...
No, that's why I was saying I don't know that I could answer. Because I feel like for me, I have such a strong level of discomfort around conflict that I'm usually pretty... But what would you say to that? If you're incensed and you can tell I'm still triggered and I don't care. I'm not done yet. I'm not done with what I want to say.
Yeah. No, and I think that the purpose of a repair attempt is not necessarily to have all feelings go away. Mm-hmm. I think that that's an unrealistic expectation. So I think it's more about, okay, I thank you for that, or I acknowledge it. You can still say, though, it would be really helpful for me to talk this through a little bit longer with you, or just because you made a joke and I know that that's part of you trying to reach out to me, I'm not ready yet, and so give me a few minutes or give me an evening and we can reconnect tomorrow. But thanks at least for trying to reach out to me.
Right.
So these are it's not, I reach out, therefore you need to be ready to accept me.
And it's all over. It's all over. Discussion over.
Right. Especially if you have somebody who tends to use humor because they want to avoid conflict. Right.
Sure.
And so that's a legitimate complaint, even if it is a repair attempt. So sometimes they're mixed bags. Right.
And repair attempts can also be used not to try and assuage the situation or have it be all better, but also just to bring it down. Like maybe you have flooded each other and now you're yelling, and a repair attempt can be this attempt to bring it down. Let's just bring it down for the rest of the conversation and be able to. So that's important to communicate to.
And I just want to reiterate something that you're good to talk about, Natasha, and that I try and talk about too. We have this fight or flight response that we inherited biologically through millions of years of evolution. We hear a noise in the jungle and we run, and the blood goes literally from our brain to our muscles so that we can run away from the lion. And intellectual or emotional threats can trigger that just as significantly or even more so as can physical. And, it's never hurts to remind people that your IQ literally drops by 10 or 20 points when your fight or flight system has been triggered. And so that's the worst time to talk through something. And I used to always think, no, we have to stay here in the room until we work this out. And and it was part of my own abandonment fears and my, from childhood, where I just thought, oh my gosh, if we leave now, maybe it'll be irreparable. But that, again, was not good thinking. Sometimes just walking away instead of staying and insulting each other and escalating the damage, just walking away, take a break, go away for an hour or two, go take a walk. You can return, you get a text from your I won't say sweetie, from your brilliant partner, and it says, hey, are you ready to regroup? And if I am, I'll say yes. And if not, I'll say I need a little bit more time. It's just going to make your repair attempts way more successful when you're not triggered.
And one thing I think that we've learned too is how you leave can be important, So let's say you need a little bit of space, and that may be actually the best idea, that leaving with things being, they're talking to you and you're leaving and you slam the door and you is different than, what? I am feeling overwhelmed by this. I'm feeling like this discussion, I'm probably going to end up hurting you or saying things I don't want to say. I probably need to take a breather. How about we come back in an hour? How about before the night is through, let's come back together and work this
Or
through.
in the morning, as Natasha likes to say.
Yes, or in the morning. But there's sort of a time frame so that especially if you're dealing with someone who has abandonment issues, it's not this leaving, it's I love you, let's come back to center here for a moment. I love you and I'm going to take a break. It's because I love you that I'm doing it, and because I care about the relationship, and we will be talking. I think that it's important also to come back around to say, and we will talk through it, and we'll talk through it so that there's that end and sometimes that closure. It doesn't have to be, exact, but this attention to, we will talk it through, before the end of night or before tomorrow, or, you know what I mean?
Absolutely. Having strategic time out strategies is, I think, super important for any marriage. Again, you can have a code word so that you just know one of you says that word, and that's kind of the end. Typically, again, the withdrawer will ask for timeouts more often than the pursuer. And this is why I think it's important to have some strategies and kind of guidelines around taking a timeout. So how I usually coach my clients is, okay, so if whoever takes the timeout, whoever says the code word or says I need time, it is now your responsibility to make sure you come back to the table, and that time frame should be no longer than 48 hours, right? So kind of giving you a 2-day, because sometimes you have a business trip, or sometimes you have, so you have things come up, but ideally it should be somewhere between half an hour and 2 hours. That would be ideal, but you can give yourself up to 48 hours to calm yourself down. So you have some timelines, just some guidelines. And the pursuer, although it will be hard for them to honor the timeout because they want to pursue, they have some some idea that, okay, first of all, this isn't just another avoidance of a conversation I've tried to have with you 500 times, or that I can manage my anxiety as the pursuer because I do have that, that assurance that you're coming back to the table.
Right.
Love it. So Natasha, I have good news and bad news. The bad news is we're at the end of our episode and we have not gone through all our points yet. But the good news is that means we get to have you back another time. Not necessarily sure if it's next week, but we know that you've set aside time to be able to be available for this podcast. And so let's have you back a lot. How does that sound?
I would love to be back anytime. I love hanging out with the two of you and everybody else who either visits you on this or is just listening to us. So that would be great.
All right. So give us again a quick plug for anything you want to plug.
Symmetry Solutions, online practice. I basically built this because I can't take everybody who wants to see me, or maybe I don't have the availability that people desire, or my rates are not fitting people's needs. And so I'm trying to have a nice spectrum of providers who are at different rates, different experience levels, but everybody's under my supervision. And so you kind of get like Natasha in, you know, in the background,
Yeah.
if you like my style. And I've picked people who I feel are really great at what they do and trustworthy, and definitely wanting to learn the things that I have to offer and teach around faith transitions, around sexuality issues, around marital things, LGBT support. So these are things that obviously through my career these are just things that kind of have fallen into my lap, you know, as I've been a Mormon therapist, things that people have come to me over and over and over again. And so I know there's a need, and sometimes having it, some people think about FaceTime versus online services differently. There's pros and cons to both, but you'd be surprised at how effective online services can be. So don't let that scare you away. Then I have my Mormon Sex Info podcast, which I think I charge for it a whole $1.25. So I know that's pricey, but the reason I do that is because I make sure that it's not just a casual podcast, that it is very informative, and that I'm actually giving you tools that you can use, and product. And this stuff that we do takes a lot of time, and I think it's okay to charge for our content. And Mormon Mental Health Podcast. I'm always trying to, that's my calling these days, my self-appointed calling that I give to myself to help out. And I love doing it. And I love the opportunity to do it through Open Stories. So
Brilliant.
All right. Well, we love having you, and we've loved your comments and participation today, Natasha. So thank you. And please join us again soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So in addition, Margi wanted to add a little segment at the end. So Margi's creative juices are flowing today, and she wants to have a segment at the end called challenges. And it doesn't mean challenges as in things we're struggling with. It's sort of ways that maybe Margi and I are challenging ourselves to do or be better, and extending an invitation to listeners to maybe do one thing differently as they leave this podcast. So we're going to share a challenge for yourself.
Well, I was going to report that last week, just knowing that we were going to do the podcast, I decided to focus on the influence. So the principle of let your partner influence you. And I was curious if you, like now that I've told you, if you could tell, there were a couple instances this past week I was sick. And there were a couple of instances where, you know, it took some effort. I could tell within me. I tend to be a simplifier, and we're moving, and some big changes are happening. If you felt that at all, and if so, where and how it made you feel?
Yes. So you're asking me how I felt.
Yeah, if you could tell that I was trying to allow myself to be influenced by either suggestions you had or things that you felt like you needed, maybe just to share one, because I think it's nice for them to see if they're not big things that we're talking about. It's kind of doable things, and then we can also pick
share an
something
instance,
next week, if you don't mind.
Yeah. So one example is that Margi was super sick last week, and she's still a little sick, and my brother extended an invitation to my son Winston to participate in a ultimate frisbee tournament over the weekend. And normally Margi would have just wanted, and health-wise, it probably would have been good for her to just stay in bed and relax. And I wasn't so much asking you to not stay in bed per se, but I really felt like this would be a cool opportunity for Winston to practice ultimate frisbee, which is something he loves and really values. And what I really appreciate is that you really are trying to allow, you know, us both to have real contributions to decisions and to the relationship. And you said, okay, let's do it. And so we went ahead and enrolled Winston like on a Thursday night, and Saturday all day he played in a ultimate frisbee tournament that he really loved. And that was super flexible of you. And I think it meant a lot to Winston, and it meant a lot to me.
Yeah, thank you. It was kind of one of those situations where we would have to get up at 5 a.m., drive 2 hours, and spend the day kind of outside. So anyway.
You sacrificed for Winston.
It was simple things, and he loved it. He's now over the moon. So it was such a great thing. And so it's that idea that we're together for a reason, right? And that we're better together than just sort of. So that was one thing that played out very, very well. And so the idea of a challenge too is just to pick something from the podcast, simple, that you could tell, maybe think in your marriage if there's something simple that you could do to kind of focus on in simple ways for the next week. And so I will be doing that again for sure. Do you know what you'll be doing?
You know what? I've enjoyed being non-reactive, and I don't think I've got it mastered yet.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So I'm gonna go for another week of trying to be non-reactive to things that are troubling or disturbing to me, and letting the emotions sort of rise like a wave and then lower like a wave. Natasha, we hushed you, but I think you need to share with us one way that you're going to challenge yourself this week.
Okay, well, so for as much as I preach on many of these things, I struggle probably the most with contempt.
Yeah.
You're an eye roller.
I'm an eye roller, and especially when it comes to politics and like positions that I try to take, and my husband's very good at being very kind of data driven and knowledgeable, and so the way, and I'm not as good at remembering all this stuff. I just know I listened to something and I know you're wrong, and so eye roll comes along.
Yes.
And I can feel it in my throat, like it's all, and my heart is like boom, 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 right? And I get this like stuff right here that's hot going on in my chest. And my ongoing challenge to myself over the last probably 2 years, I've been really trying to be mindful of when I'm in that spot. And, I think I've improved, but I could still go a long way as far as using that information that my body gives me to then slow myself down instead of continuing to engage in non-healthy behavioral patterns. So there you go.
Yes, I love that.
So less eye rolls for Andy this week.
Right. Yes.
All right. Ask Andy to email me at the end of the week. And
I will tell him to check in.
All right.